Welcome to Sci-Fi Love Chronicles, where cosmic passion meets interstellar mystery. What happens when love defies planets, species, and even time itself? In this channel, you'll explore unforgettable stories of alien romance, sacred bonds, and encounters that rewrite the very fabric of the universe. Stay with us, because what begins as a whisper across the stars might just awaken something in you. Watch till the end. There's more than one secret waiting. The mysterious arrival. John Harris had long stopped expecting surprises. At 50, his world had shrunk into a quiet rhythm of warm coffee, wilting roses, and memories that no longer spoke. His mornings were soft, predictable, wrapped in silence, and sunlight that felt more like a whisper than a greeting. And then came the sound, not thunder, not a storm, but a slow, deep hum, a low vibration in the air that made the wind pause, as if it too was curious. A truck, silver, smooth, like it, had been carved from moonlight. It slid down Maple Drive like it didn't belong on Earth. It didn't rattle. It purred. John stood at the edge of his porch, mug forgotten in his hand, breath caught somewhere between past and present. Then he saw her. She stepped out from the back of the truck, and the world changed. Tall, towering even, but not in a threatening way. No, she was grace made visible, elegance woven into skin that shimmered like opal in sunlight. Every curve of her body seemed touched by starlight, each step as fluid as smoke on water. She didn't walk. She floated, or so it felt to John, whose knees nearly buckled at the sight of her. Her hair, long and silver blonde, moved like silk in slow motion. Her clothes were strange, yet beautiful, flowing, iridescent, whispering, secrets with every motion. But her eyes, they were the color of ancient galaxies, deep violet, alive, intelligent, endless. When her gaze met his, just for a second, John forgot how to breathe. It wasn't just beauty, it was something other. Something primal, something sacred. A pull in his chest like gravity had changed direction. And then there was the furniture, if you could call it that. Orbs hovered mid-air, spinning gently. Boxes made of a translucent material glowed softly as they floated through her open doorway. One of them emitted a low chime, like a lullaby played on glass. John blinked hard. Was he dreaming? The woman looked up again. This time her eyes narrowed slightly. She saw him. Not just noticed. Saw. Through the layers of his skin, through the years he carried, through the silence he'd grown so used to. His heart stuttered. He ducked behind the fence like a startled boy. A few seconds passed before a voice, low, soft, almost melodic, slipped across the air and curled into his ear. "Hello, neighbor," she said. John stood frozen. The sound of her voice was like warm wind over ice. It didn't just touch him, it melted him. Something ancient inside him stirred. Something he'd buried long ago beneath habits and caution and the ache of old loneliness. He peeked again. She was smiling now, softly, knowingly. He didn't smile back. Not yet. His body remembered how to move, but barely. His mind raced with questions too wild to ask. Who was she? What was she? And why, for the first time in years? Did the world suddenly feel alive again? Contact from the stars. She was standing at the edge of his lawn the next morning, barefoot, her toes barely sinking into the dewy grass. The rising sun painted her skin with gold and pearl, and the mist around her seemed to glow as if drawn to her warmth. John didn't remember walking outside. One moment he was sipping coffee. The next, his feet had carried him across the porch and into the morning light like he was being summoned. Not by voice, but by presence. "Good morning, John," she said, her tone gentle but ringing clear in the stillness. She said his name, like a secret being unwrapped. "I hope I didn't disturb your evening." He stared, blinked, nodded slowly. No, not at all." She smiled again, and this time it wasn't just beautiful. It was dangerous, like sunlight on deep water, hiding something beneath, something he wasn't ready to understand, but desperately wanted to. "I'm Tani," she said. "Tuni, but you can say it however your tongue allows." He chuckled, nervous and a little breathless. "You don't sound like you're from around here." "No," she whispered, her eyes glinting. "I'm not." Silence fell between them, not awkward, but thick, alive. Behind her, strange plants shimmered in her yard. Some swayed gently without wind, others emitted a soft hum, like they were purring in her presence. One of them opened slowly, revealing something that looked like a crystal flower with a glowing center. John couldn't stop looking. He had lived next door to silence, to peeling paint and empty windows, and now he was next to a being who brought light, movement, and unknowable depth. "I saw the things you brought in yesterday," he said carefully. "Some of them floated." She tilted her head. "Of course they did. They respond to intention. Your species doesn't do that." John laughed quietly, unsure if she was joking. "No, our boxes are heavier, much less obedient." Tina's lips curved upward. "How strange." A pause, then her eyes softened. "You're wondering what I am, aren't you?" He swallowed. "Is it that obvious?" "It's written all over your body, John. In your pulse, your breath, your hesitation." John looked down, almost embarrassed. She took a slow step closer. He could smell her now, like night air after the rain, with something sweet and ancient woven through. His heart skipped, traitorous and eager. "I'm from Eliso," she said, voice like silk. "It's far, farther than your species has traveled, but not farther than your mind can reach." "Eliso," he echoed. The word tasted unfamiliar but beautiful. "I came here because Earth hums differently. Your world is clumsy, but curious." "I like that." He raised a brow. "You came here alone?" She looked up toward the sky, the clouds swirling like they recognized her gaze. "Yes," she said softly. "Some journeys must be made that way." The wind shifted. A shimmer passed over her skin, as if her emotions were slipping through the barrier of her body. He could feel her somehow, subtle waves of heat and ache and longing. Not quite physical, but not entirely separate from it either. John took a breath and asked the question that had been burning in him since he first saw her. "What are you looking for?" Teeny's eyes met his, unblinking, vast. She stepped even closer. "You." And just like that, the world tilted. The invisible Bond John didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, no, but because his body hummed like a tuning fork left too close to a melody only he could hear. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. The way the wind bent around her, shape. The way her smile lingered like heat in his chest. The way her voice, his name on her lips, felt like it had existed before language itself. By morning, he was already outside, pretending to tend to his roses. But his eyes, like his thoughts, were drawn elsewhere, and as if summoned by desire alone, she appeared. Tni stood by her garden, dressed in a flowing robe of iridescent silk that caught the sunlight and scattered it like liquid stardust. Her long fingers were buried gently in the soil, tending to a flower that pulsed with a golden glow. It looked alive. It looked aware. He didn't speak. He just watched her, and she didn't need to look up to know. "You feel it too," she said quietly, still facing the earth. John's breath caught. Feel what? Teeny slowly turned toward him, her hands glowing faintly, her skin shimmering, with a light that seemed to respond to the question. Or maybe to him. The pull, she whispered. The thread between us. It's begun. He stepped closer, unsure if his legs were moving by will or by gravity. Hers. What is it? He asked, voice low. Why does it feel like I've known you before? Because you have, she said, eyes soft, ancient. Not in this life, not in this body, but something in you recognizes something in me. John felt heat rising in his chest behind his ribs, blooming like a secret flower. His lips trembled. But how? Tani moved toward him, slow and fluid, like a wave approaching the shore. She reached out, not touching, just hovering her palm above his chest. The air between them crackled. The scent of her, warm, electric, laced with starlight, wrapped around him. Our kind don't fall in love like yours do, she said. We remember love. We return to it. And in that moment, John felt something shift inside him. A door, maybe. A veil lifting. Suddenly he saw flashes, not memories, but impressions. A night under twin moons. A hand reaching for another across light years. A kiss that once ended a war. Then it was gone. He stumbled back, eyes wide. What was that? A glimpse, she said softly, of what we once were, of what we could be again. His hands shook. She reached for him, and this time, she touched him. Her fingers brushed his, and it was as if the world held its breath. The garden shimmered, the air thickened, the light around them bent, dancing with a pulse that didn't come from the sun, but from their skin. You're changing, she whispered. Your energy is syncing with mine. John swallowed hard. Is that safe? Knee smiled, a slow, radiant curve that carried both tenderness and danger. No, she said, but it's real. He should have pulled away. He should have asked more questions, but instead he let her hand slide into his. And just like that, the bond was sealed, invisible, unspoken, unstoppable. When reality begins to shift, it began with the flowers. At first, John thought it was just coincidence. His roses, once dull, dry, barely clinging to life, had burst into color overnight. Red so deep it looked like velvet. Petals soft as skin, glowing faintly in the moonlight. And not just his garden. Every plant on the block had changed. Faster, wilder. As if spring had drunk too much wine and decided to skip the rules. Then came the lights. Street lamps flickered as John walked past. Not randomly, rhythmically, in perfect sync with his heartbeat. And when he stood beside Tenny, the lights pulsed brighter, warmer, as if the city itself was watching them and smiling. At first, John was afraid to ask, afraid the truth would be too strange to hold. But one night, as they sat together on her porch, their fingers just barely touching, he found the courage to whisper, "Is this you?" Teen tilted her head, her violet eyes glowing under the starlight. "It's us." "Us?" She nodded. "Our connection is not just emotional, it's energetic. It creates waves, ripples in the fabric of your world. Earth is reacting to what we feel." John looked around. The wind had stilled. The stars above seemed closer, brighter, like they were listening. He swallowed. "Is that normal?" Teeny smiled, slow and soft, like she was trying not to scare a frightened animal. "For Eliso, yes. For Earth?" She leaned closer, her breath brushing his cheek. "It's a little dramatic." He laughed, and the plants near them quivered in response. A small tree sprouted a new blossom before his eyes. His smile faded. What happens if we keep getting closer? Her gaze turned serious. The energy between us will intensify. Reality may stretch, bend, bloom. Emotions will manifest. Beauty, chaos, light, even storms. John looked into her eyes. And if I pull away? She paused. Then everything quiets again. The colors fade. The earth forgets. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. Not from fear, from awe. He didn't want to go back to the quiet, to the empty nights and untouched roses. He wanted this, even if it meant letting the world burn in wildflowers. Suddenly, a loud crack split the silence. They both turned. From Teeny's yard, one of her alien plants had exploded, its glowing vines writhing into the sky, coiling around her satellite dish, wrapping themselves through the fence, crossing into John's garden. She stood immediately. "Oh no." "What is it?" John asked. She walked toward the chaos, skin glowing brighter with every step. "My emotions," she said tightly. "They're leaking. The bond is intensifying faster than I expected." Vines snaked around John's rose bush, but instead of choking it, they merged. Blossoms twisted together, forming strange new hybrids. Earth and Eliso, red and gold, breathing. John stared. "It's beautiful." Tenny didn't smile. "It's also dangerous." He stepped closer. "To who?" She turned, her face illuminated by the flickering vines. "To everything that isn't ready." A moment passed. The wind picked up. The air buzzed with unseen tension. John looked at her. He wasn't sure what scared him more, what she was, or how much he wanted to go further. "I don't care," he said quietly. Tenny blinked. "You should." And then, slowly, she reached for his hand again. The vines calmed. The stars above pulsed. Once, the world exhaled, and somewhere deep in the fabric of reality, a door opened. The calling of the joining. They sat in silence. But the silence wasn't empty. It buzzed. It breathed. It trembled with something unsaid. Tenny's living room was dimly lit, not by lamps, but by glowing orbs floating gently near the ceiling, like stars caught in a slow dance. The walls shifted colors every few minutes, as if responding to emotions neither of them spoke aloud. John sat on the edge of a couch that molded perfectly to his shape, hands resting on his knees, unsure whether to lean forward or fall back. Nye stood near the window, framed by the moonlight, her silhouette both graceful and haunting. Then she turned, and everything changed. Her skin glowed a deeper hue, almost gold. Her eyes shimmered like stardust caught in violet flame. But more than her appearance, it was the feeling in the air. Thicker, heavier. Like the room itself had taken a deep breath and refused to let it go. She walked toward him, slowly, like each step was part of a ritual older than language. "John," she said softly, "my people experience desire differently than yours." He blinked. "Desire?" She nodded once. Her voice grew quieter, more intimate. "It's not just a physical need for us. It's a cycle, a calling. We call it the joining." The words wrapped around him like incense smoke. He could feel them sinking in, not just into his ears, but into his chest, his blood. "What does it mean?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Tenny sat beside him, careful, slow, like she knew the weight of the moment. "When the cycle begins," she whispered, "our emotions grow, wild. Our thoughts blur. The body changes. We become light, heat, need." John swallowed, hard. "And you're in that cycle now?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. She looked into his eyes. "I am in it, John. Because of you." He felt the words like a current. Her gaze burned into him, not with fire but with invitation. A longing so ancient, so cosmic, it bypassed lust and went straight to something sacred. Tini's hand reached out, trembling ever so slightly. Not from fear, from restraint. "If I don't complete the joining," she said, "my body will begin to fracture. Emotion will override form. Energy will tear at me from the inside." He stared at her, stunned. "You're saying you'll die?" "No," she said softly, shaking her head. "But I will lose myself. My clarity, my reason, and the bond. We've started. It will unravel painfully for us both." John exhaled, voice low. "So what happens if we complete it?" Her fingers brushed his, and for a moment, the room disappeared. He saw stars exploding in slow motion. He saw galaxies twisting into each other like lovers tangled in infinite embrace. He heard music, not sound, but feeling, and he saw himself, naked, not in body, but in soul, offering himself to her, not with fear, but with faith. Then it was gone. He gasped. She pulled her hand back gently, respectfully. "That," she said, "is the beginning." John stood slowly, unsure whether his legs would carry him or collapse. He walked to the window, looking out at his garden. The flowers were blooming in shapes no human gardener had ever imagined. He turned back to her. "And if I say yes?" Tini stood too, her body bathed in pulsing golden light. Her voice a prayer, a promise. "If you say yes, John Harris, we won't just join bodies. We will join everything." His heart raced, his mind reeled, but his soul had already said yes. The sacred union. The stars above Maple Drive had never shone so brightly. They burned like witnesses, like silent gods holding their breath. Inside Tini's home, time didn't pass. It pulsed, the air shimmered, the walls glowed. Every object, alien or familiar, vibrated with a quiet tension, like the entire room was suspended on the edge of something ancient and inevitable. John stood at the center of the room, barefoot, his breath shallow. Around him, soft waves of light rose and fell like ocean tides, as if the room itself was alive, breathing through them, with them, for them. Tanai approached him. She no longer walked, she flowed. Her robe had slipped away, not in shame or seduction, but in ritual. She stood before him not as a woman, not even as an alien, but as a being of energy, clothed in light, her skin radiant, shifting between gold and violet, her eyes now 2 galaxies wide open. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice now a melody, half breath, half song. John nodded. "Yes." She stepped closer, close enough that the warmth of her body wrapped around him like a second skin. "And yet, you stay," she whispered. "I don't want to miss this," he said softly, "even if I can't understand it." Her hands rose, hovering near his chest. "Then surrender." "Not to me," she said, her gaze glowing, "to what we are becoming." John closed his eyes, and the moment her palms touched his skin, the world shattered, but not into pain, into color, into sound and memory and sensation he didn't know a body could hold. He saw himself, not as he was, but as she saw him. Not just the man, but the soul, burned, bruised, brave. He felt her, the full vastness of her, the loneliness of galaxies, the hunger of stars, the endless ache of beauty too big for any single form. And in that space between, something joined. There, hearts no longer beat separately. Their breath became one current. Their skin shimmered with the same pulse. He held her now, not just with arms, but with truth. They didn't move like lovers. They became movement. Each caress was a vow. Each breath a surrender. The ceiling disappeared. The walls bent away. Above them, the stars spun faster, brighter, responding to the union. The earth below trembled gently, not in fear, but in reverence. Tini's body arched against him, and with it, waves of light exploded outward, flowing. Through the floor, the walls, the air. Plants outside bloomed out of season. Streetlights burned with violet flame. Clouds above opened to reveal not sky, but the deep eye of the cosmos. Watching. Blessing. And when the final cry of union, wordless, holy, passed between their bodies, the house filled with a glow that made night forget itself. They fell, entwined, onto the shifting couch, both breathless, silent, glowing. I rested her forehead against his. "You've crossed the veil," she whispered. "There's no going back now." John smiled, eyes still wet with awe. "I wouldn't want to." The world awakens. The morning after the joining did not begin with birdsong. It began with silence, a silence that didn't feel empty, but full, charged, sacred, new. John opened his eyes, and for a long time, he couldn't remember where he was, or who he was. He only remembered the light, the warmth, the way her body had curved into his like it had always belonged there, the way the stars had answered. He turned. She was still beside him, curled in the soft, shifting couch. Her skin no longer glowing as it had the night before, but now glistening softly, like embers beneath skin. Sleeping, yet fully present. John watched her breathe, and for the first time in years, he felt what he could only call peace. But it wouldn't last. A knock came. 3 soft taps. He frowned. A voice followed, shaky, confused, familiar. "John? Are you all right?" It was Mrs. Peterson, his elderly neighbor, the one who never missed a day watering her tulips at dawn. John pulled on a shirt, heart racing. He opened the door slowly. The moment she saw him, she gasped. "Good heavens, John, what happened to your face?" He blinked. "What?" "You're glowing." And he was. Not like Tini, not celestial, but his skin held a faint shimmer, like it had tasted starlight and hadn't fully let it go. He glanced at his arms. The freckles on his skin now looked like constellations. I don't know," he said. Mrs. Peterson looked past him, into the house, and her breath caught again. Tini had stepped into view, barefoot, bare-shouldered, wrapped in something translucent and flowing, not quite fabric, not quite light. Her violet eyes sleepy but sharp. "Hello again," she said kindly. Mrs. Peterson took a full step back, clutching her purse to her chest. "Oh dear. Oh dear." Tini tilted her head. "You're frightened." No, I mean, maybe a little," the old woman stammered. "There's something strange going on. My cat, he floated last night. The plants, my begonias, they're humming. And the moon. It turned violet." John looked at Tini. "Is that us?" She nodded slowly. "The bond has awakened more than just us, John. It's waking the earth." Outside, the wind shifted. Leaves on trees shimmered silver for a moment. A bird flew. Overhead, trailing a faint streak of gold behind its wings. Somewhere in the distance, dogs howled, not in fear, but in rhythm. Something was resonating. The planet had begun to feel, and it didn't stop there. Later that afternoon, a black car parked near the curb. Unmarked, governmental. Curious eyes behind tinted glass. Tini stood by the window, wrapped in silence. "They've noticed," she said softly. John joined her, heart steady. "Will they come for us?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for his hand. You've started something that can't be undone. Not by fear, not by force. He gripped her hand tighter. And what about the others? He asked. People like me, like you. Will they understand? Tanii's eyes glowed again, just faintly. Not yet. But one day, they'll feel the pull too. Behind them, in the heart of the home, a light began to glow. Soft, pulsing, alive. John turned, sensing something. Strange, Tania, he whispered. What is that? She stepped forward, hand pressed to her belly. The light came from within her. Her skin warmed beneath her palms. Her eyes filled with something between terror and wonder. It's begun, she said. What has? She looked at him with a smile made of starlight and storm. Our child. The child of two worlds. The light from Tanai's body didn't dim. It grew, soft at first, like the glow of a distant candle, then stronger, warmer, pulsing in slow rhythm, like a second heartbeat. John watched her from across the room, unsure whether to kneel or run. But he didn't move. He simply stared, his breath caught, his heart a drum too fast to be calm, too steady to be fear. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, a blend of awe, concern, and something he could only describe as sacred surrender. Wasn't expecting this, she said quietly, hands still resting over her lower abdomen, where the glow centered. Not so soon. John stepped forward. You're sure? She nodded. There's no mistake. It's real. It's alive. It's ours. His knees nearly buckled. Ours. The word hit him like lightning made of silk. But how is that possible? Last night was the first... He stopped. There was no logic here. No biology textbook to explain what was now pulsing in the air between them. He placed a glowing palm over his chest. Eliso life doesn't follow your rules, she said gently. Creation responds to resonance, to truth. When two energies merge with intention, life answers. John stared at her. Are you saying we willed this child into being? I'm saying, she replied. The universe listened. Outside, the wind shifted again. Clouds parted. A low hum spread across the neighborhood. Trees leaned inward as if bowing. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried, and then went silent, soothed by a calm that swept invisibly across the town. It wasn't just weather. The world was adjusting. John turned back to her. What? Will the child be? Teeny sat slowly, hands cradling the glow, her eyes suddenly distant, like she was looking not through time, but across it. She will be more than either of us, she said. She will speak the language of emotion and energy. She will understand Earth's grief and Eliso's longing. She will bridge worlds and possibly tear them apart. John felt cold, then warm again. And she'll be born here? He asked. Nay. Nodded. Unless the universe decides otherwise. Then came the knocking, not gentle this time, sharp, measured, military. John froze. Nye stood. They're not ready, she whispered. But they've seen the signs, the light, the change in the field. They know something's here. John moved toward the door. Then we hide? No, she said. Then we protect. From the living wall behind her, a panel opened. A shape emerged, soft and translucent, like armor woven from dreams and light. She wrapped it around herself with a single movement. And when she turned back to him, she no longer looked soft or curious. She looked like a guardian of worlds. They won't hurt me, she said. Not if they still wish to dream. John took her hand. And I won't let them touch you. She smiled then, quiet, proud, a flicker of violet fire in her eyes. You're changing, John. You're not just human anymore. He nodded once. I don't want to be. Not if it means losing this. The glow in her belly pulsed brighter. The knock came again, harder this time, and the stars above Maple Drive burned just a little closer. Those who know the secret. The third knock didn't wait for an answer. It came with authority, sharp, mechanical, deliberate. Bam, bam, bam. John opened the door slowly, his hand tight around the knob, heart loud in his chest. 3 figures stood on the porch. Black suits, black ties. Faces carved from stone. Behind them, the unmarked car idled like a predator. One of them spoke, voice smooth but practiced, too calm to be kind. "Mr. Harris, we'd like to ask you a few questions." John held the door halfway open, body shielding. The view inside. About what? A flash of a badge. Not police, not military. Something in between. Something secret. The agent didn't blink. "Your new neighbor, and the energy disturbance detected over this region. We've tracked anomalies. Electromagnetic, biological, gravitational, all centered on this address." John's spine tensed. He kept his voice even. "She's just a gardener." A beat of silence. Then another agent, younger, stepped forward with a tablet. On the screen, a satellite image. A map of the neighborhood. And in the center, a blooming pulse of violet light, radiating outward like ripples in a pond. "Is that a flower too?" the younger agent asked. John didn't answer. From behind him, a voice rose like velvet over glass. "She's not a threat." Tunny stepped forward, bare feet silent on the wood floor, her form wrapped in flowing iridescence that made the agents squint. Her eyes met theirs, calm, ancient, unapologetic. "I am not your enemy," she said softly, but the air shifted. The trees outside shivered. And for a moment, even the shadows held their breath. The lead agent didn't flinch. "You've altered the local environment, manipulated flora, fauna, atmospheric pressure. Residents have reported hallucinations, physical changes, floating animals." "My presence activates what your world keeps dormant," Tanai interrupted, still gentle. "The Earth remembers what you've forgotten." The agent narrowed his eyes. "We have protocols for unknown entities. If you're carrying any form of infectious biopattern..." "She's carrying a child," John cut in. Silence. The agents looked at each other. "A child?" the younger one echoed, uncertain now. Tanai stepped forward. The light around her belly glowed brighter, pulsing slow and steady. "This life is not a threat," she said, voice lower. "It is a bridge, a gift." The lead agent's jaw tightened. "That's not your decision." "No," she said, eyes blazing now. "It's hers." She placed both hands over the glow, and the house responded, walls humming, floor vibrating, softly beneath their feet. The energy wasn't violent. It was protective. Alive. The agents backed away instinctively. "We'll need to run scans," one muttered. Tinny didn't move. "You'll get nothing if you come with fear." Then she did something they hadn't expected. She opened her arms, not as a gesture of surrender, but of trust. "Come," she said. "Feel for yourself, not with machines, with your breath, your instincts. If your kind still remembers how." No. One moved. The agents weren't trained for this kind of confrontation, because this wasn't a war, it was a birth. The lead agent pulled back, eyes unreadable. He handed John a card. No name, no number, just a symbol. "We'll be watching." Closely, and then they left. The hum faded, the plant settled, the wind returned. John closed the door. Tinny looked at him, something fragile in her voice for the first time. "They fear what they cannot hold." John touched her cheek, glowing with warmth. "They can't hold you, Teeny, and they'll never touch her." Behind them, in the soft-lit corner of the house, the unborn child glowed brighter, as if she'd heard every word. The dream of the light child. The nights grew softer after that. No more knocks. No more shadows behind tinted windows. Just wind through leaves, moonlight on skin, and the gentle glow of something becoming. And I no longer walked. She floated. Not physically, but spiritually. Her energy softer, rounder, like she had become a vessel for the universe itself. And within her, something stirred. Not pain, not movement, but thought. At first it came as whispers in her sleep. She would murmur, in a language John couldn't understand, eyes closed, fingers curling slightly over her belly. Sometimes she would smile in her dreams. Sometimes she would cry. One night, John woke to find her sitting on the edge of their bed, eyes wide open, skin lit by the softest silver glow. She's dreaming, Tinny whispered. John sat up, voice low. The baby? She nodded. She sent me something. A feeling, a vision. He moved beside her, touching her hand gently. What did you see? Tinny turned toward him. Her eyes were filled with something not quite fear, but not peace either. I saw Earth, but not now. A future. Fractured, dimming. John's breath caught. But then, she continued, I saw her, our daughter, walking barefoot on a field of ash. Every step she took, life returned. Flowers rose behind her. The wind changed. People followed. Not because she told them, but because they remembered. Remembered what? John asked. Tunny smiled. The kind of smile that made stars pause in their orbit. That they were meant to feel, to love, to dream. She reminded them. John stared at her, overwhelmed. She's not even born yet, he whispered. And she's already changing us. Tanai took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. The glow beneath his palm warmed, and then he saw it. Just for a second. A dream, not his. He stood in a garden where gravity bent like silk. He saw plants singing as they bloomed, their petals humming melodies only the heart could hear. He saw children, human and not, laughing together beneath skies that shifted color with emotion. He saw a little girl with violet eyes and dark hair, his hair reaching toward a wounded stranger and healing them with a single breath. He gasped, pulling back. Tinny looked at him with tears in her eyes. You saw it too. He could barely speak. Was that real? She's sharing it, Tinny said. With us, preparing us. John pressed his forehead to hers. Then we'll protect her. Whatever it takes. Tinny closed her eyes. She doesn't need protection, she whispered. She is the protection. Outside the window, the stars blinked quietly. Inside the home, the light pulsed, steady, calm, eternal, and the dream continued, even while they were awake. When Earth begins to whisper, it started with the trees. Not in the cities, not in the places where concrete choked the soil, but in the wild spaces that still remembered how to listen. In the forests of Finland, old pines began to lean closer, as if drawn toward a lullaby carried on the wind. In the hills of Peru, vines bloomed out of season, their petals glowing faintly in the dusk. In the sands of Morocco, desert flowers unfurled under the stars, humming low like hearts that had never forgotten how to love, and everywhere, all at once, dreams began to change. People across the world woke with tears in their eyes, though they hadn't cried, with names in their mouths they didn't know, with the echo of a child's laughter in their chest, and none of them could explain it. But all of them remembered. Something, a moment, a warmth, a sense of being held by something vast, ancient, gentle. And though they went back to their lives, they walked differently, slower, softer, more alive. At home, John noticed it too. The birds didn't just sing, they sang in harmony. The roses didn't just bloom. They glowed, faintly, as if bathed in unseen starlight. Strangers passed him on the street and smiled, not politely, but like they'd known him in another life. Even the wind felt different, not colder, not warmer, just aware. One afternoon, he sat beside Teeny on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the glow from her belly now more constant, gentle, steady, as if the child inside was listening to the world, and the world was answering back. "They feel her," Teeny said, sipping a warm herbal brew that smelled like honey and stardust. "Who?" John asked. She looked at him, eyes soft. "Everything." John stared at the horizon. The sun was setting, slower than usual, or so it seemed. The clouds above moved like dancers instead of storms. "I used to think the world was tired," he said. "And now?" she asked. He smiled. "Now I think it's waking up." That night it rained. But the raindrops weren't cold. They were warm, soft like skin, and when they touched the earth, tiny green shoots sprang to life. Even the puddles shimmered with light, reflecting not just the sky, but something beyond. The children danced in the rain, laughing. Elders stood still, eyes closed, as if hearing an old song they thought they'd lost. And in a hidden room, surrounded by soft light and love without name, a child not yet born turned in her mother's womb and smiled. When the child speaks light, the night was still. So still, in fact, that John could hear the slow rhythm of the moonlight breathing through the leaves. Tinny sat upright in their bed, eyes wide open. Her skin glowed with soft pulses, like the flicker of a distant star trying to speak in Morse code. "It's time," she whispered. John blinked awake, then sat up fast, heart suddenly weightless. "Now," he breathed. She nodded, but she wasn't in pain. There was no screaming, no shaking, no water breaking. There was only light. It began in her chest, a soft golden shimmer that spread slowly through her limbs. The entire room responded. Walls became transparent. The ceiling dissolved into sky. John reached for her hand. It was warm. Too warm. But not burning. Radiant. He looked at him, a strange calm on her face. "She doesn't want to hurt me," she whispered. "She's guiding her." Own birth, and then the air changed. The wind outside paused. The trees held still. Even time held its breath. And the light in Tani's body flared once, bright enough to erase shadow. And then she exhaled. And with that breath, the child came forth. Not with blood and tears, but with a single burst of shimmering, soundless color that swept through the house like a song made of light and memory. John stared, stunned, trembling. There she was, the child of Earth and Eliso, small, perfect, floating inches above Tanae's arms. No cord, no cry, no gravity, just presence. Her eyes were open, impossibly wide, and within them, John swore he saw entire galaxies spinning slowly in silence. She looked at him, not like a baby, like someone who had waited lifetimes to see him again. And then, without moving her lips, she spoke. Not words, not thoughts. Light. Beam of soft white shimmer rose from her chest, touched John's heart, and in that moment, he saw everything. His own birth. His mother's hands, the way the earth used to sing. The first flower that bloomed on Mars. Tanae, in another life, standing in a field of stars, whispering his name before language was born. And then it was gone. The light faded gently, folding, back into the child's body like petals returning to a bud. She closed her eyes and slept. Tanae held her now, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, as if all the pain she didn't feel in her body had chosen her soul instead. John fell to his knees beside them, breathless, overwhelmed. She spoke, he whispered. Tanae nodded. She told you she remembers. She told you she's home. Outside, the stars pulsed, once, then again, and in the gardens of Maple Drive, roses bloomed in perfect silence. The light spreads. No announcement was made, no sirens, no headlines, and yet the world knew. Like a ripple through still water, something shifted. Not in cities first, but in the spaces between them, in quiet forests, in deserts that had forgotten, rain in frozen lakes that began to hum with thaw. The light had been born, and it had begun to whisper. Children began dreaming in colors they couldn't name. Elderly hands, once stiff with age, moved with unexpected grace as they watered plants that now bloomed under moonlight. In a refugee camp in the middle of nowhere, a toddler reached into the sky and pulled down a spark that healed her mother's fever. And no one could explain it, but no one questioned it either, because in their bones, in the quietest parts of themselves, people knew something beautiful had entered the world. At the heart of it all, in a modest home on Maple Drive, John stood barefoot in the garden. He looked at his roses, no longer red, but a soft blend of violet and gold. Their petals moved ever so slightly, as if breathing, as if listening. Behind him, laughter. Not loud, not wild, just pure. Tanai sat beneath the arbor, cradling their daughter in her arms. The child now smiled often. Sometimes she floated. Sometimes she slept in a bed of living vines that coiled protectively around her. But always, she glowed. Not as a miracle, but as a reminder. John walked toward them. He knelt, placed a kiss on Teeny's forehead, then one on their daughter's tiny, glowing hand. "Do you think the world's ready for her?" he asked softly. He looked at him, eyes filled with stars and stillness. "No," she said, "but she's ready for the world." He smiled, not because everything was perfect, not because they were safe, but because for the first time, they were real. That night, the sky over Earth shimmered, not with spaceships, not with war, but with a pulse, soft, rhythmic, tender, like a heartbeat, from the center of the universe, saying, "We are here. We remember. We begin again." And beneath that sky, in a home that glowed like a lantern for the soul, a man once lost in routine, and a woman born from stars, held the child of two worlds in their arms, while the garden bloomed around them forever,